So today I want to talk about an attack which is a really good example of the constant evolution that we see in cybersecurity, and it's a major wake-up call. It combines both the increased use of cloud services and the increased use of bring your own device, so personal laptops, personal desktops, folks working from home, and what that can mean for security. And the result can be devastating, and it's a problem that's likely to get worse before it gets better. And it isn't using any fancy 0 days, and it's not being done by a nation state. And it's possible that thousands of organizations are vulnerable. I'm talking about the recent compromises that have happened against Snowflake cloud instances. In this video, I'll talk about what happened, the history of these types of attacks, why they're interesting, and crucially, what we can learn from them. And I'll suggest 6 possible mitigations that can reduce the risk of these attacks being successful. But first, before we dive in, it really helps me if you like this video, you comment, and even better if you subscribe. Let's get stuck into it. So, what happened? In April 2024, the incident response firm Mandiant identified that Snowflake cloud instances were being compromised. Snowflake, if you're not familiar with it, is a cloud data analytics platform. So you can basically throw lots of structured and unstructured data into it and do some really clever analytics. Mandiant identified that these compromises were through using legitimate credentials, and they've identified that these were credentials, so usernames and passwords that were stolen using info stealer malware. I'll talk a bit about that later on. And in the cases of the victims they've identified, the attacker was able to use these stolen credentials because they didn't have multi-factor authentication or MFA configured. So once the attacker had the credentials, they could just stroll right in and steal data. And that's exactly what they did. Let's talk about the history of these attacks. So ransomware is a very established problem for us in security. Criminal groups have become very apt and able at being able to compromise organizations, move laterally in networks, escalate privileges, delete backups, and deploy ransomware, as well as stealing data. But those attacks, sometimes referred to as big game hunting attacks, they've got a big overhead. They take time, they take investment, they take tooling, that costs money. And it's always possible that during the attack, you get detected and then eradicated from the network. So all the effort you've put in has gone to waste. And what these attacks show is this evolution in attacker tactics, techniques, and procedures and the targeting that they're doing. If you can compromise a cloud service and get in there and steal data, you don't need to invest in fancy ransomware, risks being detected and eradicated. You can be in and out of there and extort an organization very simply. And with the increased use of cloud services, these attacks are going to become more and more common. And this isn't the first time an attack like this has taken place. I remember back in 2015, MongoDB, which is a database service, by default, you could turn off authentication. So it transpired lots of folks were putting these databases online. They had no authentication, and attackers were able just to log in, not even log in arguably, just connect to it and start stealing data. Perhaps a more recent example is one of the 2023 breaches at Okta. Now, this was where a Okta support employee had logged into the Okta support portal using their work laptop in Chrome and logged into their personal Chrome profile, which meant the profile saved some credentials they were using. In this case, it transpired there were credentials for a service account, which meant they didn't have MFA. And the attacker had compromised that person's Chrome account so they can then log in, lift the credentials, and then use them to log into that particular service that Okta were using. And that's relevant for this attack because although in that case it wasn't the use of an info stealer, it was the use of personal IT, albeit a personal Chrome account, which was the initial access used for the compromise. We've also seen a number of attacks against different file transfer applications. So we've had attacks against MoveIt. A couple of years ago, we saw Accellion as well, which is another file transfer application, being targeted by groups who would steal the data, then extort the victim. Again, very similar here, where all they have to do is get into one service, then get access to data, get it out, and then do their extortion. So why is this interesting? The use of credentials stolen through info stealers is really interesting because it's becoming more and more common. If you're not familiar with info stealers, they're basically malware that just hoovers up credentials and session tokens from machines. And Generally, they're not a big problem for enterprises because we use things like endpoint detection and response, antivirus, hardening, we've got firewalls, web proxies, a bunch of security controls that make deploying malware quite challenging. However, when we talk about the bring your own device and folks using their own IT, often they don't have the same controls. They can download and install whatever they want. They might not be using any security agents or preventative technologies to stop malware attacks and info stealers being present on their machines. And they might be installing suspicious software, maybe even illegal software, which often can come with info stealers. And what they're going to do, they're just going to hoover up every credential they see, the websites use that, and then fire it back to some command and control. So we end up in this weird position where in the corporate world, we've got corporate IT, which is well protected. It's accessing cloud services. Everything's pretty good. And then we've got this kind of almost shadow IT world of people using their own devices where we have no concept of the security on those. But folks are still using them to access cloud services. And it's those that hackers are increasingly targeting with info stealers to steal those credentials to gain access to those cloud services. And it's a major risk for security teams. When we talk about private IT and personal IT, often there's just no visibility into that space. We've got no logs, there's no hardening, there's no agents running, we've got no visibility. So we're really reliant there on either users doing the right thing, which can be very difficult, or having the right hardening on cloud services and authentication to make it impossible for them to do the wrong thing. And in Mandiant's recent blog about this attack, which is well worth a read by the way, I'll share a link to it in the description, they also highlight how in some cases contractors can be the problem. And I've seen this before in lots of organizations where you'll be working with a third party or maybe some fixed term contractors who will be working for a short period of time for you. They'll need access to services, so you'll create them an account and you'll give them access, but they're using their own IT, and their IT hygiene and their security hygiene may be very different to what you expect. It can become quite a blind spot. So it's these two issues combined that are creating this huge risk for us, and lots of organizations will be suffering from this, where a massive increase in the use of cloud services and then a big increase as well, and the pandemic helped with this, is big increase in bring your own device usage, people using their own IT, where, as I said, we just don't have any visibility. And it's all of this combined, complete with some lack of security hygiene, that's meant that these Snowflake attacks are taking place. So it's folks who are using Snowflake who haven't enabled MFA, and then people accessing those services probably from their own IT kit that's using or has an info stealer on it that's stealing the credentials, sending them to the attacker, and then they can just log in. And for more information on info stealers, there's a great video by my friend Gary Ruddle where he steps through in a lot more detail what they are and how they work. And there's a link up top about that, or that side, or this side, and I'll leave a description to it in the video as well. So how can we defend against this? Well, for the specifics of how you can secure a Snowflake instance, there's some great advice that they've published about that. I'll share a link to it in the description for this video. But when I think about cloud services in general, there's 6 main mitigations that for me stand out. The first one, and if you're not new to security, this hopefully isn't a surprise, but multi-factor authentication, and ideally phishing resistant multi-factor authentication like a YubiKey. In the case of these attacks where the credentials were compromised, MFA would have significantly hindered the attackers. Now, we know there are ways around or through MFA, and there's unfortunately in some cases accounts that can't support MFA, like service accounts, and I'll talk about ways later on that they can be secured. But MFA really is the big hitter that can reduce the risk and the likelihood of these attacks happening. The second point, I think, is password hygiene. As I mentioned earlier, some of the passwords used in these attacks date back over 4 years. That's a long time that if that account or password is compromised, that an attacker can be leveraging it. So, and this is where info stealers are changing the landscape a little bit. Some of the previous advice has been that we should have very strong passwords so that they have really strong hashes, and that means that they're very difficult to crack if you steal the hash. And we should let them persist for a long time, because we know users, when they change passwords, they usually just add a 1 to it or a 2 or some sort of really basic iteration that kind of defeats the point and annoys users. Info stealers are changing that landscape a little bit because they're stealing the clear text password. So it doesn't matter if it's a 10 character basic password or a 30 character alphanumeric with symbols and everything. It doesn't really make a difference. So the importance of, particularly for these accounts that can access critical production services that might be holding vast amounts of personal data, they need to be rotated on a regular basis. Another factor on password hygiene is the avoidance of password reuse. And I read about this in lots of other breaches where an attacker is able to, say, compromise somebody's O365 password. So they've got the account name and the password, and then they try that on a bunch of other cloud services or even on-prem services, and it works. Not because they're using SSO, more on that in a minute, but because the user is just reusing the same password again and again.
Not a great plan.
My third suggestion is the use of SSO, or single sign-on. So this is where, for cloud services, we can put our own identity provider in front of it. So to authenticate to it, you have to go through what we're using. So that might be Entra ID or Okta, or one of the other ones that are available. The benefit is really that then we control the front door. So we can enforce MFA, we can enforce good passwords, we can remove accounts very easily. We've got great logging of who's authenticating to that. And there's a bunch of other benefits that I'll talk about later on. And closely linked to SSO is the avoidance of local accounts for some of these services. Now, shout out to Adam at Push Security. It was his suggestion for this, and I hadn't heard of it as a problem before until he mentioned it. But this is where on some cloud services, you might use SSO, so you might think you're very well protected and that you see all the access to that service. But you can also have local accounts, so administrators can create accounts that are just on that service. And if those get compromised, with your SSO, you've got no visibility, you've got no control, you're very reliant on people doing the right thing. So avoiding the use of local accounts or protecting local accounts is another really important factor. My fourth suggestion, and this is another one that the folks over at Snowflake suggest, is controlling network access to these services. So if you're running, again, a critical business service, or you're storing a lot of sensitive or personal data in a cloud service like Snowflake, they've got built into it, and also you can do this through most SSO providers, is define a network range that is allowed to access that. So for example, you might add your office range, your VPN, so it means the attacker has to be in your network to be able to access that cloud service. One of the downsides is, and some people would argue this is a major downside, is that then remote workers have to use a VPN to access all of these. I think it's quite a low cost nuisance to people using them. But then the benefit is that an attacker could have valid credentials for that service, but it's incredibly difficult for them to then get access to it via your network. It's a really sensible control. I think the cost of it's very, very low. It's very simple to roll out. Mostly, I appreciate enterprises can be very complex, but it does mean that if you can't have good password hygiene or you can't use tools like SSO, at least you have the confidence the attacker has to be in your environment to use stolen credentials. The other key point with a network allow list, and I've kind of alluded to these before in this video, is service accounts. So if you're not familiar, service accounts are credentials that get used programmatically. So for instance, if one application wants to talk to another, or you've got a script running that's going to jump into an application and move some data around, the challenge there is often service accounts, well, not often, but almost always, can't support multi-factor authentication. There's nobody to approve a request. There's nobody to plug in a YubiKey and put in their PIN. So it's really common that service accounts don't have MFA. So if you are using those, it is really important, two things. One, use a network allow list, and secondly, heavily protect those credentials, because you can't have the confidence that MFA will protect them. The Okta breach I mentioned earlier, where a user had had the Google account compromised and they had stored credentials that they were using on a Chrome browser at work. Well, those credentials were for a service account, and because it was a service account, there was no MFA. So the attacker was able to use them, and that caused that breach. My fifth suggestion is restrict access to only corporate devices. So similar to the network restriction, in some identity or SSO providers, you can also restrict the access to only devices that you as an organization own and operate. So the cost of the attacker continues to go up. Not only do they need credentials, they need MFA, they need to be on your network and on one of your devices. Now, if you're using Entra ID and you've got the right license level, you can leverage conditional access to restrict this even further and look at device compliance. So for example, you are able to say that you can only access these particular services if you're on a compliant device that has EDR installed, has been hardened, has the firewall turned on. Again, further increasing the cost of the attacker for them to gain access to that service. Combining all of these, you then need the credentials, you need current credentials, you need MFA, you need to be on the network, you need to be on a corporate device that is also compliant. That makes it really tough for hackers. And then my final suggested mitigation, so number 6, is all about monitoring for cloud services. There's some really good tooling out there now, either looking at things like logs on firewalls or agents or plugins that are deployed on machines that can identify when folks are using new cloud services, being it software as a service, platform as a service, or infrastructure as a service, and then notify the security team of that. So you can make judgments on, is it authorized? Are they using things like MFA? Have they got SSO? Are they using, in some cases, these tools can identify, are they reusing passwords? Giving you that visibility is really powerful. And out of all these compromises involving Snowflake, I wonder how many security teams knew that that even existed, let alone knew if it had MFA or good passwords or reused passwords. Visibility like that is really, really tough. I realise that may seem like a lot of stuff to do, and in a complex enterprise that can be really difficult as well. And you'll always get the challenge to say, why do we need MFA if we're restricted just to our network? Or why do we need to restrict it to our network if we also restrict it to corporate devices? The way I think of this, and I've talked about it in a previous video, is the principle of defense in depth. We need independent, overlapping rings of controls because some of them can fail and we need other ones to compensate for that. And these attacks are a really good example of this, where the credential is a ring of control. We expect it to work, right? And in this case, because of info stealers, those credentials got compromised, and then that ring was effectively useless and there was nothing else to catch those attacks. So that's all I've got time for today. I hope you found this video useful. I think this Snowflake incident is a really good example of these two risks combining: the increased use of cloud services and also folks using their own IT kit that hasn't got the sort of security we'd expect to see in an enterprise. And I think with the number of cloud services and the increasing number of cloud services, these attacks are only going to become more and more common. Well, thanks for listening, and I really appreciate you watching this video. If you'd like to give it a like or a comment or a subscribe, I'd really appreciate that. And I'll see you again next time.